star's right. Where? Right there. Right where? Straight ahead, across the field. Is she behind the rhino? What? She's right there.
Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard Podcast. So today's episode going to be discussing the Philadelphia 76ers and their pretty unceremonious end to their postseason run. They have some really tough decisions ahead, kind of heading into the offseason. So what should they do to kind of get back on track? If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. Another just crushing defeat in the playoffs for the Philadelphia 76ers. And for Sixers fans, it was agonizing for a whole new slew of reasons than the prior runs. I think if 76ers fans had been realistic heading into the playoffs, they probably knew that this group wasn't going to be competing for a championship this year, but the manner in which they lost to just roll over and die the way that they did in both Game 5 and Game 6 just has to snuff out any optimism that an Embiid and Harden duo is going to lead to an NBA championship at any point. Where to even begin with this mess? I think it's important to address the Heat side of things and more specifically the Jimmy Butler side, because this was a bit of a revenge tour for Jimmy Butler. The 2019 season was meant to be the year that Sam Hinkie's vision came to fruition. The generational talents, Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, were beginning to blossom. The remaining draft assets that they got throughout the process were kind of pushed in to acquire established stars like Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler. And that year in the playoffs, the Warriors were kind of limping to the finish line before they ended up completely falling apart in the finals and just succumbing to injury. The Harden-led Rockets, they were eliminated in the second round, which left Western Conference Finals of the Portland Trailblazers and the Golden State Warriors. Out east, the only real competition was this young, not quite there yet Bucks team who they just hadn't quite figured out how to really unlock Giannis in the playoffs. So the table was set. The path forward was cleared. Everything just kind of seemed to be breaking Philly's way for that championship run, but it just didn't happen. Kawhi Leonard hit probably the most absurd buzzer beater in the history of the playoffs to send Philadelphia home in Game 7 of just the second round.
It's off to Leonard, defended by Simmons. Is this the dagger? Game! Series! Toronto has won! 15 fourth quarter points by Kawhi Leonard.
And that Raptors team eventually went on to win the title. But that summer, both Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler were free agents, and both wanted and felt they were deserving of a max contract. Philly ended up offering Tobias Harris a max deal, but elected to lowball Jimmy Butler and eventually move off of him completely, which seems just insane in hindsight. But even at the time, it was a little bit of a bizarre decision. Tobias Harris was never anywhere near the level of player that Jimmy Butler is or was. So why would Philly make that decision? Beneath the surface, there was trouble brewing, and the organization had a decision to make. In the 2019 postseason and that Toronto series specifically, Ben Simmons really struggled and was eventually kicked off the ball in favor of Jimmy Butler. All season long, Simmons had been the guy, the primary ball handler, the guy setting the table for everyone else. And in that Toronto series, that kind of flipped where they decided to go with Jimmy Butler because it was the only way they were going to be able to win games. And just in general, Jimmy Butler is kind of ill-suited to play alongside Ben Simmons versus like a Tobias Harris and Ben Simmons pairing, and vice versa is true for Joel Embiid. He's much better suited to play alongside Jimmy Butler than he is Tobias Harris. Also, the organization felt that if they brought Jimmy Butler back, that Ben Simmons would view that as a slap in the face. So in order to avoid a situation where they were upsetting Ben Simmons, Philly elects to let Jimmy Butler walk out the door to kind of cater to him, cater to Simmons, and did a sign and trade with Jimmy Butler that brought back Josh Richardson. Fast forward to this season where Ben Simmons has demanded a trade. So all of that pandering and coddling and building the roster around Ben Simmons's talents versus Embiid's and trying to kind of cater to him, all of that was for naught. And that leads to kind of the James Harden, Ben Simmons swap. And I've talked about how difficult it is to determine a winner for that trade ad nauseum. So I don't want to spend too much time on it. I will say that I've been seeing a lot more Nets won the trade buzz on social media. And I just don't think it's obvious at this point. I'll get into the James Harden stuff in a minute, but at least he did play in the postseason in whatever capacity you consider what he did playing. That's more than we can say about Simmons. So forgive me if I'm not ready to crown the Nets the winner of a trade on the back of a player who hasn't even suited up for them yet and a broken back at that. I will also say that this trade has a chance to be the least consequential blockbuster trade in NBA history with the direction that things are going for both of the major players involved. There's a real possibility that those throw-in draft picks that the Nets got from Philly might be the most consequential pieces of that deal. And that's just insane to me, but that's absolutely in play here. Moving on to the blame pie for the results of this season, there's really two figures that stand out to me as mostly to blame for the way that the season ended, and Joel Embiid is not among them. I really, really, really respect Joel Embiid, and this entire season as a whole did nothing to change that. I had Embiid as my MVP, although I will say I'm not upset that he didn't get it. Jokic also had a really great case for MVP and is very deserving. I just don't think that there was a wrong answer between the two this year. I really feel strongly about that. But I just felt the way that Embiid navigated that whole Ben Simmons saga and kept the team winning games. And then later on in the year, he had to integrate one of the most difficult guys to play alongside of in James Harden because of the contrasting play styles that they have. And the 76ers just kept winning games. It was just all really impressive to me. And then in the postseason, he plays with torn ligaments in his shooting thumb, and that's the injury that ended Jaylen Brown's season last year. He's playing with a literal broken face, and by the end of the Miami series, he was kind of grabbing at his back a lot, so possibly a bad back. It's all just very impressive. I'm just not sure what more he could have done here. And I've seen some really, really wild takes from the national media kind of blaming Embiid for being distracted by the MVP results. And that's why he didn't play up to his standards, or that's why he didn't play up to that MVP level, or just that's why the team lost. And that's just a straight up ridiculous take to me. Maybe it was the fact that Embiid was being triple teamed anytime he got anywhere near the basket, or maybe it was that he was physically falling apart, or maybe it's just that the Heat have a much better top to bottom roster and Spoelstra was just running a coaching clinic on Doc Rivers. There are so many reasons that you can point to for why the 76ers lost this series. And Joel Embiid being distracted by the MVP results are probably not even in the top 10 of those reasons. So just because Embiid is the 76ers best player, I suppose he deserves some of the blame here, but I really just don't know what more he could have done. And that leads me to Doc Rivers. And listen, I have made my feelings on Doc abundantly clear. I think he's likely the most overrated coach in the history of the league. And I certainly think that he's the most overrated coach in today's league. So he deserves a fair chunk of the blame here. And just a couple quick examples of where his game planning really failed the team. And I want to start at the beginning of this series with the whole DeAndre Jordan thing. I guess it was clear to everyone but Doc and LeBron that DeAndre Jordan has basically been unplayable for about 3 years now. So without Joel Embiid for game one and game two, Doc decides to cart the corpse of DeAndre Jordan out there in the starting lineup for reasons that remain unclear to me today. And sure, game one, give that a shot, whatever. But he was a minus 22 in 17 minutes of that game one. In 17 minutes, just 17 minutes of action, the 76ers were outscored by 22 points while DeAndre Jordan was on the court. So after that, and after witnessing Bam just dribble around him for just dunks every single play, why would you card him back out there for game 2 in the starting lineup? Why would you not try Bassey or Reed or just go with a really small lineup just to try something crazy? And to really put into context how bad DeAndre Jordan was in this series, the 76ers were outscored by 54.2 points per 100 possessions during the DeAndre Jordan minutes. The resulting offensive and defensive ratings were 95 for offensive rating and 149.2 for defensive rating. That is abominable. And let's be fair here. If Doc had gone like small or gone to a different lineup and not played DeAndre Jordan, would it have changed the results of game 1 and game 2? Probably not, but it would have given them a better chance. And Doc's stubbornness, especially under the media scrutiny he received after game 1, when everyone was like, why are you playing DeAndre Jordan? He was really stubborn in the face of that and almost defiant. So it just shows to me that Doc's need to be right is more important than his need to win games. Another example of the game plan failing I want to quickly touch on is the game 6 strategy. Every time they showed Doc Rivers, every time they cut away to him on those mic'd up moments, when the game was still close in the first half, mind you, he was wanting to push tempo, just like really harping on pushing the tempo and keeping the offense moving. So I'm left to assume that the strategy that Doc Rivers cooked up was to try to turn things into a track meet with the Miami Heat. And part of me understands that the Heat were one of the slowest teams in terms of pace during the regular season. So I think that's maybe what he was trying to take advantage of. But it really just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. For the Sixers side, you have a really dominant post scorer who's coming off of an injury where he wasn't able to do cardio during the recovery of that injury. And while Embiid wasn't out that long, you could tell in that game 3 and throughout the series, really, that his lungs just weren't quite there. And then also you have this really kind of old looking out of shape point guard in James Harden. So you have a dominant post scorer coming off of an injury where he wasn't able to do cardio during the recovery. And while Embiid wasn't out that long, you could still tell in game 3 and kind of moving forward that his lungs just weren't quite there. And then you also have James Harden, who's looking really kind of old and out of shape. And you compile that with the fact that the 76ers have a really short bench. It just isn't a team with a lot of depth. So what was the plan when guys get tired? The Heat pretty much hang their hat on their depth and just in general have a really tough time finding minutes for all the guys that they want to play. So it seems like the strategy that Doc Rivers cooked up was playing right into the Heat's hands for that game 6. If I had been the coach or if I had been the decision maker, we would have been walking the ball up the court as the 76ers, just trying to keep the game close, limit the amount of possessions to try and attempt to save Joel Embiid and James Harden for the fourth quarter where we can just kind of steal it at the end. The Heat have had questionable clutch time play all series and all season. And that's where you're hoping that your star power, Joel Embiid and James Harden, could just kind of take you across the finish line. So I really don't know what he was thinking, trying to turn it into a track meet. Like I said, maybe it was the pace thing, or maybe he just didn't want to face the Heat's half court defense. But I still think that that was pretty much the opposite of what they should have done. Also, just my God, the excuse making from Doc post game. After the game, he talked about what a great job he did all season and how no one expected them to be there and how the Heat were just a much better team.
How much have you thought about job security?
I don't worry about my job, Howard. I think I do a terrific job, and if you don't, then you should write it, because I worked my butt off to get this team here. When I first got here, no one picked us to be anywhere. And again this year, the same thing. So if that's how anyone feels, write it, and I'm going to feel secure about it.
It's a results-based business, and that's
It
why
is, but you don't do it every year. Every time you're wrong, should you lose your job? No. So it's the same thing, all right? But listen, if you believe that, then go with it. I know what I did this year, and I feel very good about that. But again, if you believe that, Howard, then you just run with it.
That's just a huge red flag for the head coach to not take any responsibility for what happened. And also, what the hell is he talking about? No one expected the 76ers to be there. They've been thrown in as finals contenders for years at this point. And sure, the Ben Simmons cloud looming over their head was kind of a little bit weird to start the season, but a big reason that Ben Simmons didn't show up was the comments that Doc Rivers made. So I'm not having that as an excuse. He's made it exactly as far as Brett Brown was able to make it in the postseason. So sorry, I'm not having it. Also, the Heat being a better team, while that may be true, it's still a little strange to hear because the Heat really have no business being a better team than the 76ers. The Sixers have a member of the All NBA 75 team in James Harden, he's former MVP, three-time scoring champ. And then they have a perennial MVP candidate and the scoring champ this year in Joel Embiid. Sure, the Heat have a more complete roster, but the role players for this group is just this smattering of G League journeymen and either undrafted or overlooked players. And it's a group that the coaching staff has developed over time into fitting a role and being effective in that role. Doc and his staff haven't done that. So again, I'm not having that excuse. He has a big part to play in the mess that the 76ers find themselves in. If I can extend Doc an olive branch, I just don't think that this year in a vacuum, he had the players to make it work. He just didn't have a lot of options to go to. After the Harden trade, the depth was pretty much gone from this team. But I'm not really that confident in Doc that even if you gave him the pieces, that he would be able to put the puzzle together. There really just isn't a coach I can think of who has done less with more than Doc Rivers throughout his career. However, I'm not giving him the biggest piece of the blame pie. That goes to James Harden. I just don't see how it could go to anyone else. His effort in the second half of game 6 was laughable, just totally laughable. It was hilarious to watch Tyrese Maxey just freak out and go nuts on James Harden, but I don't blame him. Harden was walking, literally walking up and down the court, and there was probably a 3-minute stretch in that game where he didn't even break into a jog. PJ Tucker was just getting this endless supply of backdoor cuts and offensive rebounds. And while that's no new news, that's pretty much always how Harden has been throughout his career. The lack of effort on the offensive end was what was really shocking. Harden attempted just 2 shots, both misses, in the second half of that game. 2 shots. That's it. Former MVP, 3-time scoring champ, 2 shots in the second half of an elimination game at home. And then after the game, when he was asked about the lack of shot attempts, Harden blamed the offense that the 76ers were running.
You only took 2 shots in the second half. Was there anything Miami did, or was it just?
We ran our offense. The ball, I feel like the ball moved and, it just didn't get back to me.
Why weren't you more aggressive?
Like I just said, we ran our offense. The ball, just didn't get back to me.
I got to be honest, James, it's hard to get the ball when you're walking up and down the court, either standing at the logo or going and hiding in the corner. And for Harden, if he had gone like 5 of 25 in this game or 7 of 30, something like that in the closing game, everyone would have still been killing him in the media, but at least it would have shown some level of effort and passion. And I think Philly fans, I'm not a Philly fan, but I would have felt a lot better about that than just him totally mailing it in the second half of a closeout game. To just not even go out swinging is just deplorable. To give 0 effort in an elimination game, I just don't understand that at all. And for Harden, that's the last 3 teams that he has given up on at one point or another, and that's all within the span of 2 years. And that leads us to the offseason, where Philly has some really tough decisions ahead. In the prior eulogies, I have made some recommendations either through the draft or free agency to kind of round out the team, just kind of some extra pieces to add. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that for the 76ers. This team has a ton of holes and on the bench, role player wise, whatever. So it kind of goes without saying that they need to better round out this roster. The fact that Niang was like a key rotation guy for them, as a Heat fan, every time he shot the ball, I was just relieved. I knew it was just a matter of securing the rebound because there was no chance the shot was going in. So, in terms of what they should kind of do this offseason, obviously you're keeping Joel Embiid, but for me, Tyrese Maxey is also going to be untouchable if I'm the 76ers. And I will admit, pretty much up until the playoffs, I was pretty skeptical of Maxey as a potential star player. And I saw some 76ers fans were saying that he was better than Harden. I was like, come on now. Like, he's a streaky shooter. He plays with high effort. Like, we've seen a lot of guys that are streaky shooters, high effort guys. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. But I was wrong. Maxey is a real player, like a future all-star level player potentially. And for the Harden comparison, if this is the version of Harden we have moving forward, yeah, I think Maxey is better. Like, I'm sorry. That gets me to Tobias Harris, and this is a tough one. Everything on paper tells me that this dude is really good, like the type of player that every team needs. A big, efficient shooting wing who rebounds. He can play either the three or the four. Sign me up for that every time. But the problem comes when you actually watch the games. He just disappears far too often. A guy like him shouldn't just completely vanish in games. We shouldn't forget that he's on the team, much less on the court. There were times throughout the season and this postseason, I'm like, is Tobias Harris hurt? I haven't seen him. And I'm looking at the box score and he's played like 40 minutes. I'm like, what? When I haven't even seen him out there yet. So while you would like to move off of him, I just don't see a way in which they are going to be able to move off of him to really improve the team. He's due around $40 million a year for the next 2 seasons. So I just don't really see who's going to be signing up for that. There's a few teams that come to mind who might be interested. The Sacramento Kings, you could maybe talk them into it if they want to upgrade on Harrison Barnes. So maybe you did Tobias Harris for Barnes, Rashawn Holmes, and Justin Holiday. Harris is an upgrade for the Kings in that Barnes slot. Now, how much of an upgrade? That's another question entirely. And then you've also got teams like the Mavericks and the Knicks. They have like a smattering of guys who are making like 10 to $18 million. So you can pool a bunch of them together to trade for Tobias Harris. But that's kind of generally, I think, the only way that you're going to be able to move Harris is like the going to the gas station and making change type deal where you're giving up the better player in the deal, but you're hopefully increasing your depth on the back end if you're the 76ers. And that kind of leads me to James Harden, the elephant in the room. What do you do with James Harden if you're the 76ers? I guess you're praying that he takes that player option just so you can kind of kick the can down the road in terms of making a decision on whether you want to re-sign him or not. For him, it's not like signing an extension like long term is going to handcuff him to Philly. We've seen that he can temper tantrum his way out of basically any situation. So if he really doesn't like the way things are going for in Philly, he can always demand a trade. But just in general, as an older player, he needs to take advantage of getting the guaranteed money while he can. If he takes that player option and doesn't sign the extension, has another bad season, the same level of money that's available to him this offseason will not be there and won't be on the table next offseason. So just him signing up for just one more year, he's taking all the risk there with basically no benefit. It's not like he's going to get more money if he kicks the can down the road here next offseason versus this offseason. So I just don't think it makes a lot of sense for him. So let's assume that he declines the player option and enters free agency as an unrestricted free agent. The 76ers have a really tough decision here to make with whether or not to re-sign him. And the way I see it, there are basically four options. Option one, you let him walk away for nothing. This is a really bitter pill to swallow. You gave up your best trade asset in Ben Simmons to get half a season of James Harden effectively. And you might be saying, well, if the 76ers, if they let Harden go, they could take the $40 million that they would have paid him for next season and go sign some other players or go sign another star player. And that's just not the reality. That's not the way the NBA salary cap works. You can always go over the cap to re-sign your own guys as long as you don't go up against the hard cap. But they just wouldn't be able to get equal value there. When I was looking at it, if the 76ers let Harden walk and everyone else, including like team options on guys like Matisse Thybulle, Shake Milton, all your cap holds, you're only left with around $25 million in cap room. And that just isn't going to be enough for you to get a difference maker who can push you over the top in terms of competing for a title. And even if you spend all that $25 million on one player, you're not going to have any money left to fill out the rest of the roster. Option two, you extend him on the 4-year max. Now, if you go that route, he's likely taking the player option contingent on you extending his contract. So it really effectively becomes like a 5-year extension. And if this scenario plays out, then he will be due nearly $62 million in the 2027 season. He will be 37. That sounds like a complete disaster to me. At 32, it looks like Harden is kind of entering the wash stage of his career. So what is that going to look like 5 years from now? Upon signing that extension, it immediately becomes the worst and least movable contract in the league, and probably the worst contract in league history. So that doesn't seem like a good option either. Option three, offer Harden less years on the deal. This seems like the most logical and least risky on paper, but I'm just not sure that's the case in reality. Harden might still feel like he's worth the max and probably doesn't feel like his play has slipped at all. So what happens if you come to him with a 2-year extension and he gets really pissed off about it? Well, then you're forced into option one, where he walks away for nothing potentially. If you go with option three, you're betting on Harden's reasonableness and understanding, and that just seems like a losing bet to me. So that's a pretty risky option if you want to go that route. That gets me to option four, which in my opinion is the best option, albeit the most difficult to pull off. And that's a sign and trade with James Harden. Give him the max extension, but pawn the problem off on someone else. And while if I'm Philly, I would love to just ship James Harden off to basketball Siberia, but since he's a free agent, he does have the option to say yay or nay on wherever you're trying to send him. So that does limit your options. The Kings are like a really good example of that. Like this is a team that would be really interested in acquiring James Harden, in my opinion, but I'm not sure that he would be interested back. The Kings, for their piece of this, they seem hell-bent on making the playoffs no matter the cost. So you could do some type of De'Aaron Fox and James Harden swap. Now, the Kings would have to throw in some guys like Rashawn Holmes and Justin Holiday to make the money work, but maybe if you're Philly, you could also get a pick or two back. And De'Aaron Fox and Maxey together would likely be the fastest backcourt in NBA history. And for James Harden, his benefit, he can just make his money and do his Harden ISO thing for the rest of his days with no pressure to perform in the playoffs, since Sacramento is really only concerned at this stage with making the playoffs. Harden doesn't strike me as a guy who's particularly interested in winning a title. So maybe it works, but I think Harden would kind of prefer to go to a large market, and that isn't Sacramento. Also, I've never been to Sacramento, but it doesn't strike me as a place with top tier nightlife. So I think that's probably a deal breaker for James Harden. It's just going to be really hard to find a deal with Harden where you can send him to a big market that he desires, just because most of the big market teams aren't going to be interested in him at this stage. Like teams like the Clippers, the Nets, the Heat, those are all no's in my mind. I don't know, maybe the Clippers would be interested, but I just don't know if it's realistic for them. It would take moving heaven and earth to kind of clear up the money and make it work for the Clipper side. I think the Bulls are a maybe, depending on where they find themselves with the Levine situation. Although I'm not sure that Harden would be interested in that. I don't know if Atlanta is considered a big market. I would certainly consider them a large market team. And I think Harden would be interested in going there, but I'm not sure how interested Atlanta would be in having Trae Young and James Harden as the backcourt. That would likely be the worst defensive team in league history, and offensively the least fun team to watch. It'd be just Trae Young and James Harden dribbling the air out of the ball while the coaches and their teammates just stand there and watch. And so that pretty much leaves the Lakers and the Knicks. Both are really desperate for a star player. And on the Knicks side, they have plenty of draft picks and movable contracts to make something work. I don't know how interested I am in as Philly in like Nerlens Noel, Fournier, Alec Burks, any combination of that role player group from the Knicks. But if I can get RJ Barrett back, a couple of picks, I can easily flip that into something else, or that I can maybe push for Donovan Mitchell with that package, or any other disgruntled star that comes available. But there's really nothing stopping the Knicks from just trading for Donovan Mitchell on their own, or any other star for that matter. So are they going to be likely willing to settle for Harden with other deals on the table? That's doubtful, but if they get desperate, absolutely. Unfortunately for Philadelphia, Isaiah Thomas isn't the GM with the Knicks anymore, so I think they're going to be smarter than to kind of push all their chips in for James Harden. That pretty much leaves the Lakers in some type of Russ for James Harden swap. And as Philly, I'm not interested at all in Russell Westbrook, but you could always get the Rockets involved with John Wall and have the Lakers send over the required picks to make that work for the Russ for John Wall swap. But I'm not sure that I'm really that interested in John Wall either, especially going from James Harden to John Wall. I mean, Wall hasn't played in like 2 seasons, so I don't really think that that makes a lot of sense for Philly. And the Pacers and the Hornets are the next two teams I want to discuss. They've expressed some interest in Russell Westbrook, so maybe I can leverage that if I'm the 76ers. For the Hornets deal, maybe Russ goes to Charlotte, Harden goes to LA, and Rozier and Hayward go to Philly with some Laker picks. I think that makes some sense. The Indiana version of that deal would basically be the same on the Lakers side. The Pacers would get Russ instead of Charlotte. And then the 76ers would get Heald and Brogdon with some of those picks. Why would either the Pacers or the Hornets want Russ? Well, he is on the last year of his deal. And while he's making a ton of money, you can use that to your advantage. It basically allows them to get out of all of the bad contracts that they want to. And that's a huge benefit to them. The Lakers are happy to get James Harden in the place of Russell Westbrook, even though it's likely going to result in a similar destiny for the Lakers next season. The Harden LeBron fit is likely just as bad as the Russell Westbrook and LeBron fit. Even though Harden's a much better shooter, Harden isn't even going to pretend to try on defense and also needs the ball in his hands like Russell Westbrook does. So I don't think in reality that does a lot for the Lakers, but I think that's something that they would be very interested in doing. For the Philly side of things, they get in either case, they get like a pseudo all-star level player in either Hayward or Brogdon. I don't think either of those guys are at the stage in their career where they're going to be making all-star teams moving forward, but they have been in the mix for that in the past. And then they also get like a solid sixth-man gunner type scorer in either Heald or Rozier. And also, just my God, those Laker picks are just looking mighty enticing. When you get to the stage where you're going to be selecting those Laker picks, LeBron is going to be retired or off the team. Anthony Davis and Harden are either going to be retired or totally washed. So the Lakers are going to be just garbage. Those are going to be some really high draft picks that you can either leverage with someone like Hayward's contract to get the next disgruntled star, or you can hold on to them and that will help you transition into the post Embiid era. Outside of Harden to the Lakers, there's maybe a Harden Beal swap in the works. That makes some sense. I heard that Embiid preferred Beal over Harden, but then Beal got hurt. So maybe you can work out a swap that allows you to get Embiid's first choice. I just don't know how interested Washington is going to be in James Harden. Even though this type of move makes sense in the long term to me, as opposed to signing Harden to some ridiculous contract, Harden and Daryl Morey are like two peas in a pod. They're almost inseparable. So I doubt Daryl Morey is going to do anything that's going to jeopardize a future with James Harden. So it's likely that Philly is going to go with option two, max Harden and deal with the fallout later. Regardless of what Philly decides to do, the championship window is now. Joel Embiid is in the prime of his career, but history tells us that the prime window is going to be shorter than any of us expect. Embiid is going to be 29 years old next season. Shaq's last great year came at the age of 30. Same with David Robinson. So the end of the MVP level big man typically comes early on, early in their career, once that player hits their early 30s. And with the injuries that continue to stack up on Embiid, there just likely aren't going to be many more years where he's one of the best players in the league. The old saying is strike while the iron is hot. And for Philly, the iron is as hot as it's ever going to get during the Embiid era. And there are real signs that it could be cooling off sooner rather than later. So the time for patience has passed. It's title or bust for them moving forward.